We want to begin by acknowledging our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tonga and Teach Nation peoples and their neighbors from north to south, the Chumash, Tataviam, Katatamuk, Serrano, Kalia, Payamukulichum, Ahashaban, Ifai Tinkai, and the Chuliai people, and the Quechan peoples, whose ancestors ruled the region that we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain caretakers, advocates of these lands, river systems, and the waters and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. For a more detailed land acknowledgement offered by the USC Van Honnock History Department, we invite you to visit their website, and I'll put a link into the chat for those of you joining us online. For those of you online, we'd love to know where you're watching from, so please let us know in the chat, and thank you for your patience as we were working out a couple of technical issues. My name is Martha Stroud, and I'm the Associate Director of the USC Dornside Center for Advanced Genocide Research, and I'm very delighted to welcome all of you here for what's really a birthday party. It's a book birthday party for this book, Ethics of the Algorithm, Digital Humanities and Holocaust Memory. And for those of you in person, we have copies of the book over there for sale, which I'm sure Todd would be willing to sign even, exclusive here at USC. So just a couple of notes for people watching on Zoom. Right now you're viewing a side-by-side of the slides and the speaker, and by dragging the line in the middle, you can make either one bigger or smaller. Probably don't need to explain that after all these years. We're going to have time for questions and discussions. We invite all of your questions here in the room and also on Zoom using the Q&A feature. And we'll ask as many questions as we have time for. We will be sharing the chat and all the questions with Professor Presner, so or comments or whatever. So if you have something you really feel passionate about saying or asking that we don't have time to get to, he will read it. So, and we ask you to please be respectful to the other attendees and to the speaker. So now, to introduce today's lecture, today's birthday party, and our speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce the founding director of the USC Dornside Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Chappelle Garrett Chair in Jewish Studies and Professor of History at USC, Wolf Gruner.
Thank you, Martha, as always, and also praise for the preparation of this event. And I think there's also still, we can say this is the birthday of the center because we are in our 10th year of the 10th anniversary. So many things to celebrate. The center was founded in 2014, and we are trying to dedicate our work to advancing new areas of interdisciplinary research on Holocaust, genocides, and other instances of mass violence. And today is one of these opportunities to bring different fields together. We try to promote the research with the unique Holocaust and genocide research resources and connections here at USC. For example, the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive, and also the Holocaust and Genocide Studies collections and archival collections of survivors we have here at the USC libraries. The center is trying with the program to transform the way how we understand the origins, dynamics, and consequences of mass violence, as well as the conditions and dimensions of resistance. We manage a rich academic program which includes hosting annual conferences, and one of the conferences we organized was actually a precursor to the talk of today in 2017. We had the very first international conference where we brought together digital humanities and genocide studies here at USC. So coming to one of other element of our program is the lecture series, and we are really delighted to have Todd Presner here, who is one of the pioneers bringing these different fields together, digital humanities and history and memory in general, but particularly in Holocaust studies. He holds the Michael and Irene Ross Chair in USCLA Division of the Humanities. He received his BA at Duke University in Literature and Philosophy with distinction, and then he got his PhD in Comparative Literature at Stanford University, and am I right? Another PhD because in the history of art, because one is not enough, right? So he holds the other one from Berkeley in the history of arts. He is teaching at UCLA since 2002 and is currently the chair of UCLA's Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies. He has a long history in kind of bringing digital humanities to UCLA. He was the chair of the Digital Humanities program for 10 years at UCLA. But he also has an impact, or had an impact, on Holocaust studies because he was the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn director of the Alan D. Leaf Center for Jewish Studies at UCLA for almost 9 years. And he was more recently the Associate Dean of Digital Innovation. He's the author of 40 articles in 7 books. I can't mention all of them. But just to highlight one of the 2 first ones, Muscular Judaism, the Jewish Body, and the Politics of Regeneration in 2007. And in the same year, which is also extraordinary, Mobile Modernity, Germans, Jews, and Trains from Columbia University Press. He later published a lot on digital humanities, like a book called Digital Humanities, or kind of based on a huge project he directed, Hypercities, thick mapping in the digital humanities. But his kind of broader kind of range also shows that he co-edited a book in 2016, Probing the Ethics of Holocaust Culture, together with Claudio Fogu and Wolf Kannstein. As I mentioned, he was the director of Hypercities, the project from 2005 to 2015, where also USC faculty collaborated, like my colleague at the history department, Phil Essing. His collaborative research, which is really the kind of one focus of his work, earned the support by the MacArthur Foundation, by the National Endowment of Humanities, the Mellon Foundation, and Google. And he got also individual fellowships throughout his distinguished careers, like the Bundeskanzler Fellowship from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. I'm just mentioning this because of my German pronunciation. Okay, so now it's time that he presents about his really very fresh out of the kind of oven book, the ethics of the algorithm. So we are delighted to have.
Thank you so much. I really am appreciative, a little embarrassed, but very appreciative. And I'm really happy to see so many of you in person, as well as welcome folks who are on Zoom. This is an honor to be able to talk about the book really for the first time since it came into the world only a couple weeks ago. And for those of you who are at USC, many of you know I've been working on and working with many of you for almost a decade or so on this book. I'll get into it a little bit. Those of you who are online, there's a lot of online materials that kind of supplement the book, and I'll talk about those as well today. I do want to just make an acknowledgement of we did a land acknowledgement. I want to do a sort of historical time acknowledgement of being here together on October 8th, the day obviously after October 7th a year ago. And I just want to, I'm not going to go into the politics or the difficulties and the violence and precariousness of the moment, but I want to talk about, just very briefly, the role of the university. It's absolutely critical that we not only have open universities, that we have a chance to come together as we are here today, that we have a chance to exchange ideas, that we have a chance to talk to one another. The university, I would say, is deeply imperiled globally. And historically, the role of a university in both the creation and dissemination of knowledge is absolutely so critical. And when we think about much of the work that I do on archives and memory, history, and testimony, I would say those things couldn't be more relevant and urgent than today. So let me begin with a couple other acknowledgements. Let's see if we can get this going. The projects that you're going to hear about today is really a collaborative endeavor, and that's deeply collaborative not only in terms of the people at the bottom, my co-authors like Anna Bonazzi and Rachel Deblinger and Litsu Fan, Michelle Lee, Kyle Rosen, and Campbell Yamani, who are actually listed on the book as co-contributors, but many other students, and also a number of partnerships over the years, not least of all with the USC Shoah Foundation, the Yale Fortunoff Archive, the Boder Archive, Voices of the Holocaust, and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. So the book today that I've been working on, I guess, for almost 10 years is called Ethics of the Algorithm, Digital Humanities and Holocaust Memory. And the basic idea is, what can computational methods do that can help us expand how we read, listen to, and engage with testimony? And there's a kind of a fundamental problem already maybe in that formulation, which is most of the ways that we engage with testimony is simply not computational. That is to say, we listen, right? In fact, the whole idea of testimony is the presence of a listener who's engaging either with a first-hand person or perhaps through various forms of mediation, listening to the words, the voices, the intonations, and the trauma, right, that someone is bearing witness to. What does it mean that computational tools are either listening, maybe as surrogates in some ways, or helping us perhaps, maybe not necessarily as surrogates, but maybe as supplements, helping us to listen and maybe see or recognize things in new ways? And it's really that second thing that I'm very interested in. I'm not interested in computers replacing human listeners. I'm interested in, can computational methods actually attune our listening, our perception to things that maybe we haven't fully appreciated, fully heard, fully digested, fully come to terms with. So this book, as I mentioned, is collaborative, lots of co-authors. I should also say it's augmented. And if you have a phone while you're reading it, there's QR codes in the book. It's better to hold it like horizontally than vertically, just an FYI. But there's actually about a couple dozen QR codes, and they take you to data visualizations, they take you to testimonies, they take you to network diagrams, they take you to interactive components, because the print page, after all, is, well, it's static. Even though the book is beautifully done, I'm very thankful for Princeton for doing it in full color. There's about 100 or so illustrations in the book, and there's also this kind of augmented supplemental component. Those of you who are online can actually go there right now. It's holocaustresearchlab.com. This is the lab that I run at UCLA. And at the top there, you'll see a link to book. It's by chapter. You can't read the whole book. Actually, you can't read really any of the book there, but you can look at all of the digital and supplemental material, as well as learn a little bit about some of the recent work that we're doing, particularly in AI. Much of that work has happened since the book has come out, but again, the world has changed, and new tools are constantly emerging. In terms of the book itself, the first couple chapters really are about this question of computational methods, algorithms. What do they have to do with ethics, particularly because we know these tools can be used in ways that are dehumanizing, that can be simplifying, that can be used for surveillance, policing, and in fact, this is something that even has historical roots going back to the 1930s and 1940s, where data collection practices, computational tools, punch card systems, early ways of processing data were used to track, register, and in fact, persecute Jews. We know that maps like this one, which I'll talk about in a minute, were the product of these kind of tools. And so there's a dialectical underbelly, right? We can't just simply use these tools without also acknowledging the complicity of the computational and social sciences, among others, in creating tools that can be used for very nefarious purposes. I spend a lot of time in the book talking about a figure I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit, called David Boder. He was an important figure for me, not only because he was the first to record the voices of survivors in displaced persons camps in 1946, but did an extraordinary amount of analytical work, which I would call digital humanities avant la lettre. That is to say, digital humanities before we actually had that term. And I'll talk a little bit about these kind of integrated methodologies that he developed, because they give, I think, kind of a through line for the book. Among other things, I'll look at kind of big data in the book, kind of like all the testimonies and the metadata related to the Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive, and then kind of zoom into particular testimonies. So I'm always going between, I call like this distant listening and close listening, because there's something about looking at the corpus as a whole, and there's also about listening to that single word, that single expression, that single intonation. And so paralinguistic cues, stuttering, size, intonation, pitch changes, even use of moving code switching are all important parts of understanding the grain of the voice and the specificity of testimony. We also develop tools for using machine learning to understand what did people actually ask, right? A lot of time we're focusing on the answers, but I think it's also really important to look at the questions. Especially when you have thousands and thousands of questions, what were interviewers actually asking to survivors? And those things have changed over time, and it's actually really remarkable to kind of shift, to look at some of those shifts. Other things I'm interested in, questions of agency. How do people express what happened to them and also what they did? These are often things not indexed in testimonies. You usually have subject headings, time and place, historical material, but I'm really interested in action. And so developing, using natural language processing to understand and characterize actions. And then a little bit at the end about AI and the future of testimonies and some of the real problems around authenticity, but also possibilities of using AI to help us to understand the historical record. So that's the book in a nutshell. I would say that it's really a humanities argument. This is not a book that's computational in a kind of maybe narrow way. It's really trying to explore ways of enhancing or supplementing the toolkit of the humanities scholar. And the toolkit of the humanities scholar is historicization. It's source criticism, right? It's interpretation. And so that's what we're doing. And to develop an ethics of the algorithm means that we're also aware that these tools, have these unsavory histories, but can be used, I think, to attune ourselves as humanists to things that may have been overlooked. So about preserving, interpreting, and perpetuating cultural memory. So among the other things that we're looking at, source criticism, multi-scalar analysis, this idea of zooming in and out, right? Lesser known stories, differences in the archive, things that are absent, close readings, and comparative analysis, all things that are enabled by computational research. So we'll start by sort of talking about the moment that we're in a little bit more. And I call this in the book, we're distant witnesses. And it's a term that acknowledges the fact that we're going to have, and this is just obvious, right, very few Holocaust survivors to talk to in the very near future. The recording of Holocaust testimony will be complete, and of course, there are many other atrocities in the contemporary world, as well as ones that occurred after the Holocaust, where the recording is still happening and needs to happen, right, with the urgency of preserving that record. I've run a program at UCLA called Bearing Witness, where students talk to survivors. We did it during the pandemic on Zoom. We did it after. We've done it this year and last. But most of the survivors are no longer with us. And so what we do have are ways of accessing those stories through digital means, right? Multimediation. So whether it's the Dimensions in Testimony project or the USC Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive, or whether it's new tools like what's being developed at the Illinois Museum of the Holocaust, where you have the VR and AR. In this case, you have an Oculus where you can take essentially you can accompany Fritzi Fischl or George Brent back to Auschwitz. This was filmed on location, and it's an immersive experience. And they did some really interesting things also with the archive, taking archival photographs, enhancing them in certain ways, but also adding sound. And so thinking here about how to extend the archive into this immersive environment. These are part of digital memory cultures, and it's part of what it means to be a distant witness when we don't have the first-hand witnesses alive anymore. Other examples on social media. This is a remediation in some ways of this is an Instagram story about a woman named Ava, a girl named Ava Heyman, who was killed. She left behind a diary, and the idea was that the Madi Kochavi and daughter Maya, created a series of Instagram posts, reimagining the diary, almost asking the question of what would it have meant if a girl during the Holocaust had Instagram. These stories, you could say, are fake in some ways because, of course, they didn't, but in other ways, they're really a product of remediating the archive and raise some interesting questions around decision-making, aesthetics, ethics, obviously, of what it means to remediate a story or historical sources in this kind of a modality. I'll leave it at that, and we can talk about some of these examples later. But I think we're at this other moment right now, which is what I would call another maybe new limit of representation, where if you've used Hello History or any kind of AI for accessing historical sources, you can chat with anybody from the past and the AI makes up the responses. I've been talking to Anne Frank and Paul Hindenburg, for example, using GPT-4. And this obviously raises huge questions about where this material is sourced from, right? What does it mean when these language models are inventing source material that is not rooted in any direct experience or embodied experience of a person? And this is interesting because here you have testimony in some ways becoming dissociated from the experiential, right? Radically dissociated. Maybe there's fragments, very distant fragments of how the language model puts together a testimony. Maybe, but often we can't trace this back. There's really no provenance network that would allow us to know where it comes from. And I think we're at a very risky moment, and I draw a line here because I think it's important to understand, where do I stand? I do not think this is appropriate, and I think it's actually very problematic when we don't understand the provenance network of how these language models work and how they produce source material that will become confusing because we don't know. It's not Anne Frank, obviously. It's not Paul von Hindenburg. So we have to really think, and there's a wonderful, I think urgent report from UNESCO that actually has begun to approach this. I recommend it. It just came out a couple months ago, called AI and the Holocaust. So that's sort of where we are. But let me take a step back and just sort of talk about why this project in the first place, why computational tools. And part of it really has to do with this question of big data and size. The archives that we're working with are these. The Boder archive is maybe the smallest, but even that's not particularly small. It's 120 testimonies. He transcribed 70 of them. It's 3,000 typewritten pages, and he indexed them. It's around 800,000 words. That's a lot of material. Take that to the next level, like with the Fortunoff archive, 4,400 video testimonies, many with transcripts. Or the Shoah Foundation, 55,000, right? Not only the Holocaust, but also Nanjing Massacre, the Armenian genocide, the Rwandan genocide, as well as contemporary genocides and atrocities. But it's not just words, right? It's also hours of video. It's millions of words. So in this case, nearly 500 million words. Millions of rows of descriptive metadata, right? Data that is about the artifact, as well as hundreds of thousands of photographs. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, also tens of thousands of testimonies. We do have a big data challenge, right? And so it's like what I can do is I can watch a few testimonies. I can maybe watch a dozen, 2 dozen. At some point, I can't comprehend the size, and I need tools to help me to sort through, search, find things. And there, it's really interesting because there's all kinds of ethical and epistemological decision-making about how we access, what we can access, and also how do we find new things, which is really what I'm about. I want to find new things. Another example, and this is not, this is a memorial, because not only archives recording testimony, but also some really interesting ways of using digital tools to do digital monuments. This is a monument at the top. It existed for almost a little more than a decade in that form there. A digital monument to the Jewish community in the Netherlands. It basically, every little pixel box represents a Jew, an adult or a child who was killed during the Holocaust. There's about 100,000 of them. And you can click on them to find out more information. But already, this might begin to kind of make you a little uncomfortable. You're like, that's kind of strange. People are pixel boxes, and even the new memorial website, which has names rather than pixels, when you zoom all the way out, you still get pixels. It's a little bit interactive because as you click on it, or as people click on it, they change from purple to orange. So you have this almost interactivity built in. And you can access stories by clicking on them, and the stories are open to the broader community. But the question that I want to ask is this one. It's an abstraction after all. And computation is always abstracting things, but can there be a generative abstraction? Can it help us to understand something more without reducing people to bare data? And by bare data here, I mean just data. That is to say, data points. things that can be measured or tracked, or things that are very reductive, rather than narratives, which tend to be open-ended, that tended to be complex, and even some data, of course, can be that too. We have a history, and this is that dialectical part, of people being reduced to bare data, and we have to confront that. And so I do in the book. I call this Computation and Complicity, and this is part of the sort of the underbelly. I showed you this smaller image earlier as a thumbnail, but this was created by the municipality in Amsterdam in May of 1941, approved to use by the Dutch Institute of War, Holocaust, and Genocide Studies. And it basically is a dot density map of where all the Jews live in Amsterdam. And what you can see is obviously not only the cluster there, but this is a product of the registration forms and the work of a particular civil servant by the name of Jacobus Lentz, who was the Inspector General for the census and was engaged in using proto-computational tools, Hollerith machines, punch cards, data collection practices, in order to really find a tally of where the Jews lived by name, by family, by biological ancestry, as well as by profession, because at different times they needed to have workforce of Jews who could be called upon. And this is what I would call bare data. Bare data is the deliberate, non-consensual reduction of human beings to a set of data points and calculations in order to transform the plurality of human life into a means for some other end. In this case, surveillance, control, policing, eventually persecution and execution and murder. Corporations create people as bare data too, often for other ends, and it tends to be drive profit. Sometimes police make bare data when you decide we're going to survey this particular neighborhood very highly today, and we're going to do so based on an algorithm telling us what neighborhood to police. This is a way that algorithms can be used in computational processes in a way that's profoundly reductive. We have to be aware of that. We can't just celebrate them as something that's always going to open up. So there are other examples, and I'll talk about this in the book. I won't have time to go into it much today. But I asked this question of, can there be reparative data frameworks? Another example, and I do some comparative work with the history of the transatlantic slave project, which documents every slave ship that came to the Americas, North and South America, over a period of nearly 360 years. And this is a product of people being turned into numbers, right? After all, you have ledgers, right, with just first names, ages, sale price, right? This is bare data. This, again, is a way of thinking about numbers and numeracy. And I'll mention the work of some very excellent scholars in digital humanities and Black studies like Jessica Marie Johnson and Jennifer Morgan and Benson Brown, who have talked about how dealing with the archival violence is a necessary part of also thinking about how to design reparative frameworks that allow us to confront these histories. So you have a visualization that would show you all these slave ships, but at the end of the day, the voices of the people that were on those ships are missing. The archive is still, can't be filled in. It's still silent. And that we have to confront whenever we're working with digital tools. So this is a question that we ask in the book, whether practice from the digital humanities can help us deepen our understanding of these Holocaustal events. That's a term from Hayden White, without reifying victims or subjecting them against to the logic or violence of numeracy. And there's different ways to do this, but I think these questions have to be front and center. So technology is a testimony. With regard to the Holocaust, we know that there's lots of ways in which testimonies have come to us, been transmitted. Some came in milk cans, tin boxes that were buried in the debris of the Warsaw Ghetto, for example, the Oneg Shabbos archive. This is a way of thinking about testimony in terms of stewardship, of essentially like a message in a bottle in some ways being sent to the future. Testimony requires a listener, right? It's dialogical. This is David Boder, I mentioned earlier. He's the guy that went with a wire recorder. That's the wire recorder. This is literally the wire. It is it's like a thinner than a hair strip, a strand of hair. And this is from the UCLA Special Collections. And he interviewed people in DP camps, and his archive is partially held at UCLA, and so I had worked quite a bit in that archive. What's interesting for me and Boder is not just the recording. Alan Rosen has done tremendous work, documenting the content, and I think the biography and much of the work that Boder did. But what Boder also did was develop tools for analyzing the interviews, tools that I would say were kind of a mixed methodology or maybe an integrated methodology, if you want to use Saul Friedlander's term of integrated history, by bringing qualitative and quantitative analyses together. He says the point-by-point analysis of these unique documents, he's referring to the testimonies, is a task for the future. It shall require the efforts of more than one investigator and the collaboration of experts of the most divergent scientific fields. He wanted to bring literary scholars together with historians, together with psychologists, together with social scientists. He called it a scientific and literary adventure, a form of experimental comprehension. So how would we do that? Well, part of it is by annotating the testimonies, by marking them up based on many things: language shifts, emotional state, voice, intonation. Another is looking at what he called these distress and relief elements, like when people were, particularly upset, and how they kind of, these almost like rhythmic aspects of a narrative. I don't particularly replicate these ideas, but they're similar to sentiment analysis in some ways today. He was doing this in the 1950s, which is really interesting. He made various kind of statistical approaches, or statistical kind of diagrams, looking at particularly kind of trying to quantify aspects of trauma. But not only quantifying trauma, he also did a qualitative analysis of the language and began doing some really interesting work counting the frequency of certain kinds of words and how people, what choices they make when they tell their stories. So it's a kind of integrated methodology that brings together, data and stories and numbers and voices and statistical and historical approaches. And for me, I spend some time trying to understand where this came from. It's a strand of Holocaust studies that I think, with regard to method, has been somewhat occluded, unfortunately. And I try to bring that back a little bit. So what does this mean, with regard to, testimonies that maybe you're familiar with, like the ones at the USC Shoah Foundation? Well, we know that, of course, the segments are marked up with all kinds of information, primarily places and people are the top, but also events and other information about the different 1-minute segments. But behind this is also this, which is data, right? It's metadata. It's data created largely by human beings. Some of that data can now be maybe cleaned or enhanced by AI. I don't know if that's something that the Shoah Foundation and others are interested in doing, but we know that this is possible, and we're doing a little experimentation in that area today. But this is not bare data, I don't think, because these kinds of data give rise to new narratives and new interpretations and new possibilities for listening. And it's, to me, how does a scholar like myself and my team and others like you engage with both the creation of the archive and ways of kind of unlocking things that maybe we haven't fully explored. So in the book I call this, there's a lot of proposing methods, imagining practices. I don't think that we have all the answers. I think I need to say that very clearly. This is not an answer book. It's not like, here's what you do. It's more like, it's an exploration, and I love this quote from Simone de Beauvoir, because she also kind of says it's the same thing in science and art and ethics. We don't have all the answers, but we do have to, there's an idea of proposing methods, of proposing approaches. It's not a recipe book. Ethics is not a moral code that you just checkbox, say, we did it. This is ethical, that's not ethical. We've understood it, we haven't. But it's a kind of a longer interpretive process, and that's part of the idea of the book. So what do? Well, among the kind of methods that we're looking at in the book are network diagrams and data visualizations, this idea of moving between different levels of analyses, using natural language processing to understand agency and expressions of what people did, doing paralinguistic and phonetic analysis, those little fragments of voice that often get left out. Imagining bringing testimonies together. I call them testimonial ensembles, where we bring together many voices. Sometimes they don't all agree with each other, and that's really interesting too, rather than individual one by one. We use machine learning and clustering algorithms to understand interview questions, and recently I've been exploring ways of using AI and language models to enhance some of the work that we did in NLP. So some of the early work that we did was just visualizing network diagrams of less commonly heard stories. This is just taking keywords, indexing terms and people, and trying to focus in on examples of less commonly either stories or less common experiences. In this case, church attendance being something that was not very common. It turns out it's actually about 700 examples in the USC out of 55,000. People talk about conversion and Christian religious observations. But in this case, there's only a smaller fraction of the testimonies. But in this case, very few had that experience. And this is just one initial way of thinking about difference in a large testimonial corpus. I've been very interested in the way the Shoah Foundation has also developed, and over time it's changed. Their interface has changed. Their ways in which they mark up testimonies have also expanded. But one of the things that has remained the same, and I think it's interesting and important, is the ontology for how the testimonies are marked up. And this is relevant for any digital archive. It doesn't matter if it's a Shoah Foundation or working in any testimonial corpus. The information architecture for how to talk about those experiences is a kind of a hierarchy based on different kinds of relationships. An inheritance relationship, which is like an is-a, like camp begging is an adaptation method. And so an adaptation methods are part of camp experiences, and camp experiences are part of captivity. It's a very granular hierarchy. And I think that this is epistemologically really very important for being able to understand, what a testimony is about. But that whole question of about also leaves certain things out. How did people react? What did they do? Right? This is more of a kind of a thing-based ontology of like what was said or what happened. You have other things like whole, part, and associative relationships. But at the end of the day, at the top of the hierarchy are these different kind of meta-categories like captivity and culture and daily life and discrimination. And you could also look, and say, okay, well, when are people talking about these things? Like, does someone talk about captivity right from the start? And is that typical or not typical? That could be interesting, because you might find unique expressions. Maybe someone's telling their story in a particular way that's not as common as someone else. So there's actually a lot you can start to do. And you ask some really interesting questions about the way in which a narrative structure is both, placed on, but also emerges from these experiences, and the ways in which people may deviate in certain ways. So one kind of zoomed out way is look at, let's say, 44,000 testimonies. This is actually a visualization of 44,429 Holocaust testimonies. Based over time, it's based on testimony percentile along the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the percentage of which they're talking about a given category. And what you see there on the left-hand side is most people start off kind of by talking about time and place. That's this little area over here. They talk about time and place for the first few minutes, and then a whole bunch of other categories come, of which the biggest one is daily life. They're relative to one another. This is basically looking at the probability that a certain top-level category is going to happen at a particular point in time. Well, over time, certain things come and recede. Discrimination and discrimination responses. Discrimination generally comes first, followed by this green band of discrimination responses. You also have, mistreatment and death and captivity, which is generally in the middle part of the testimonies. And then you also have things like liberation and post-conflict in the second. That's these red and purple. And then finally, this big band here of still and moving images. That's interesting because that's sort of the structuring principles by which they also recorded these testimonies. There's an idea of getting about 20% before the war, about 60% during the war, about 20% after. And so the extent that the testimony corpus mimics that, you also have a way of kind of looking kind of macroscopically, not microscopically, macroscopically at an entire archive. Again, it's interesting too because you can look at ones that deviate from this, right? Ones that have a completely different structure. Well, one of the things that we also did was compare that to, and this is going to look a little funny because there's so fewer, but this is 246 Armenian genocide testimonies. It's a lot choppier, it's not nearly as smooth, but there's some really salient differences. And part of it is because the USC Shoah Foundation didn't record the Armenian genocide testimonies. They inherited them from the Armenian Film Foundation. Most were recorded in late 70s and 80s. They tend to be a little shorter. They tend to be actually a little bit more, maybe we would say experimental, but I'd say they're experimental only in the sense that we didn't quite know what the genre of recorded testimony looked like. And they do many different things. This particular term here, this is still and moving images. Remember it was at the end only at the other one? It persists throughout. Why does it persist throughout? Is because the Shoah Foundation made the decision to mark up all these other things that were going on, the panning, the zooming, the changing of lighting. And if you look at some of the stills, you immediately see that there's a lot of performative dimensions in these testimonies that's very different than a single person in a couch talking at you. This is nearly 2 minutes of silence where Rosa Pillian is showing the tattoos on her arm, and she was tattooed because that was to identify her as Christian and of course then persecuted. And part of the performance is for her to show these tattoos as the camera revolves around her. It's not quite miscellaneous footage, although it's marked up as that in the metadata, but I think it's actually kind of the the people that created and also gave the testimony also trying to experiment with what a testimony is. How does one testify? What kind of material is this? And so structurally, again, they look, they sound, and they are fundamentally different. It raises interesting questions too about whether an information architecture system developed for the Holocaust can be generalized and applied to other testimonies. I think there's certain reasons that it should be and can be, and there's other reasons why it could be problematic. And so I think this is something worth having a conversation about, especially if the Holocaust becomes almost like a paradigm for the recording practices with regard to other testimonies. I think there's much we can learn about how archives are formed and also how they change and grow with respect to differences in experiences and expressivity. And that's something you can show kind of computationally. That's something that I talk about in the 4th chapter of the book. On to other stuff, kind of like we're going to make a shift again because there's a lot I want to cover and I don't have so much time and I know you'll have questions. But let me talk a little bit about some of the ways we use natural language processing. So one of the things I've wanted to do for a while are produce almost like counter indexes. So we have human indexing, often focusing on named entities, geography, places, events. But I thought that there's always so much more in testimonies, especially around agency, about these micro-histories. In some ways I reference Wolf's work here, around micro-histories of defiance or unindexed actions. How can we find them? How can we appreciate them? Can computational tools be used to help us uncover them? And also to think, beyond individual testimonies or the whole corpus, there's this kind of meso level of kind of a testimonial ensemble, like bringing together pieces of many different testimonies to help us understand something. So I'm not the only one who's been doing work in this area. I'll mention in passing Gabor Tot, who was a fellow, I believe, at the Shoah Foundation for a while, who had a project with the Fortunoff archive of looking at things that are less commonly tagged experiences such as shame and how to find testimonies where these terms are used or these experiences come up and creating almost a new interface, right? A new way of accessing the archive. Again, it's kind of like realizing the archive is always generative. There's always more in it. We're never done listening. And I think that's one of the principles, I'd say, of the work that I've tried to do. So a couple of examples, expressions of agency. We use Spacy, which is a natural language processing tool, to create what's called parsing trees. So a parsing tree is all the grammatical structures in a sentence, like my father had to leave his home. This is something that he was compelled to do. He had to do that, right? The verb, the noun, the parts of speech, different kinds of things. I removed the yellow patch, right? Taking the yellow star off, and an expression of agency by, the survivor. A feeling, I'm not ashamed, or I remember a Christian woman. These are all examples. Now, granted, these are kind of like small categories, like little pieces, but when you look at all these little pieces as a whole, they become really interesting. And they also allow us some insights into testimonies in ways that we wouldn't otherwise know. So here you have acts of defiance, which is actually great that it's actually there. It's not always there. Children and anti-Semitic experiences, anti-Semitism, and then this section of remembering throwing a stone at another kid and feeling like, oh my gosh, I need to run home, this kid's gonna come after me. And even this reflection at the end is maybe I wanted to kill that boy. So what we do is we take a transcript and we create what I call a paratext of these things called semantic triplets. And it looks basically like this. I take the same text and using NLP, I look at column E as the subjects, column F is the verbs, column H is the objects, phrases, and you basically get these kind of almost like little pieces of a text. I threw one stone, I got a boy in the head, I was afraid, and it's not always grammatically perfectly correct because you're taking it out of, a transcript. But it becomes interesting when you see it in terms of well, what did someone actually say they did? What did others do to them, right? So expressions, for example, of like passive speech. Like you could look at all the we expressions in a transcript that are passive or coercive. Here's one from Jürgen Bassfreund. You know, we were sent to work. We were given the prisoner's coat. We were shoved into barracks. We had to stand for days. We were transported from Auschwitz. We had to, you know, go into railroad cars and so forth. So this becomes interesting, again, because you're taking a transcript and providing like a new lens, right, for what had happened. And you can try this all online. It's actually all live. You can use the QR code. You can use this. Maybe I'll just show you really quickly if I can. But better put on my glasses so I can see in case it comes up. Yeah, so this will take you to a dashboard. And we tried this a number of different ways, of which we've experimented with what we call these triplets. And basically the idea is to take, again, a testimony, look at the subjects, look at the verbs, look at the objects, see them in a context. The people had a premonition. The screams were terrible. They were unable to find their wives, right? So these are the sentences that have been transformed. We have the original sentences, which you can click on over here. You see the context terms, and we have sort of two different approaches to this. I'll give you an example of what one could do with this. Let's say you're interested in we. And you know what? I think I'll do it just by just coercive and passive speech. So we'll take all those away. And this is for a number of four different testimonies. But you get a sense, you know, we were rubbed with kerosene. We had to take a cold shower. We had to walk across the yard. We were given a damp shirt. We had to leave, right? This is kind of like this like repetition of violence, right? At the level of the granularity of the single voice. And this is one of the things that one can begin to do with NLP. One can also see some really interesting examples of agency. So instead of having this, we might change it to agency active with I as a subject. And I don't know, look at all the things, you know, from a whole testimony. You know, I must save my child. I tried this. I was scrubbed with this. But also, Erica Jacoby here, you know, I saw you say goodbye. I jumped over the fence. I carried my grandfather down the hill on my back, right? Really extraordinary, right? A tiny little thing that we could miss, but how interesting. She carried her grandfather down the hill on her back, right? It's right there. I jumped over the fence. Later in the camp, she talks about, you know, I snuck into the boiler room. I toasted my bread for her. She's referring to her mother. I got an onion. Right, again, these tiny little expressions of agency that now I think allow for almost a new reading experience. At least that's the idea that we're going with here. So let me see if I can go back. Let me see if I can get back to where I was. I need to go back on the top here. See if I can move that down. Actually, I think this is on top of that. So how will I refine my... I can minimize that, yeah. Let's see if I can do that. There we go. Thank you. All right, let's go back here. So I won't have time to go into much of this, but what eventually one can do with this, among other things, are looking at shared networks of experiences, of beginning to look at, you know, in this case, like just take a particular term, like the Star of David. But I want to look at how everybody talked about the Star of David, like 1,000 people talking about anti-Semitism in Europe. And so I then have, again, the same kind of process of taking those transcripts, putting them into a paratext of semantic triplets, looking at what people did. I hid the Star of David. I covered the Star of David. We had to wear the Star of David. They painted the Star of David, right? And this is over, you know, a couple dozen testimonies, but there's thousands, right? Thousands and thousands of people who mention, you know, similar experiences. So this is a way that we kind of talk about agency with regard to testimonies. We make network diagrams, and the one thing that I think is important for kind of like, and again, a kind of an ethical question, is the connection to the primary source. I make an argument in the book about the importance of digital provenance, about the importance of being able to go back to the primary material. And so the connection to that triplet of having to get off the sidewalk to the exact part of the testimony where that's mentioned, right? That connection is important for the authenticity and the authority, I think, of the work that we're doing. It's not, you know, disembodied. So I'm going to skip ahead maybe to one last thing, and I want to talk a little about this, because, and then maybe end with AI. I think we have maybe 10 or so minutes. Is that okay? experiments with machine learning for interview question classification. You can look at this also online. But the idea that we had here was basically I wanted to take around 90,000 questions in the foundation years of a number of archives. So Boder's archive from 1946, the first couple years of the Fortunoff archive, the first couple years of the USC Shoah Foundation, and the first couple years of Dimensions and Testimony, and find out what are people asking, right? And the Dimensions and Testimony is a little different because this is an open platform, right? The public is asking questions. Very different than maybe a trained interviewer asking questions. But nevertheless, in the early years, they weren't quite as trained as in the later years, right? Even Boder was not exactly trained as an interviewer. And so sometimes questions he asks are sometimes a little odd or maybe a little different than the way they would be phrased nowadays. So the idea was to use a clustering algorithm called BERT, which is a transformer-based architecture, figure out the semantic similarity between questions, cluster them together by topics, and then look at those topics and see, like, are questions about hunger asked, or daily life, or questions about trauma, or questions about anti-Semitism, questions about, the future, whatever it may be. Because Boder, it turns out, really doesn't ask any questions about trauma at all. That's really interesting because he's known for studying trauma, and yet when you look at the questions, he's not asking about that. He's asking about plenty of other things, but that's not, questions of memory and trauma are really not at the foreground of what he's asking in 1946. And as one of my colleagues suggests, Rachel Deblinger, maybe one of the reasons is that everyone he was interviewing was deeply traumatized. You didn't have to ask about this obvious thing. But that's interesting. He does ask a lot about their intentions of where they want to go, to Palestine, they want to America, to wherever. This idea of kind of this moment. Well, questions of trauma become very important later on for the Fortunoff archive. And they become very important, I think, for questions in memory studies. And we can sort of see how those questions are phrased, and they also change over time. So you can look at online all this. This is a kind of, again, a bringing computational and human labeling together. We're looking at using some AI now to disambiguate pronouns, which is something that, of course, you could say, like, what did they do next? Who does they refer to? And the AI can help with a context window tell us that, oh, they are referring to your parents, as opposed to, say, something else. Again, this is one that you can play with online. Maybe I'll just very briefly just show you that. This is Boder's. This is all 16,000 questions Boder asked. So it's a complete archive in some ways. And what you can do is you just hover over the questions. In this case, in the red here, these are bodily violations and concentration camp experiences. These are labeled by me. The BERT doesn't tell us what they actually were about, but they do say that there's a commonality in the intention and meaning of those questions. And now, if we left it just at this, it would be, I think, problematic. But what I wanted us to do was then see those questions in context. So you can then look at every testimony by question and answer, and you can sort them by topic. So you can say, I'm really interested in, I don't know, particular questions around Auschwitz or arrest and beating, and I want to know how often that person was asked these questions, and how does it compare to someone else who's asked these questions, or where in the testimony were they asked these questions, right? And one can see the entire corpus right here. You can see the entire corpus right here. And you can also see, when obviously the interviews are longer and when they're shorter. And if you just hover over, you can see by question and by answer. So this allows, again, a kind of a recontextualization, right? You can ask these kind of questions when you use these digital tools to investigate, something that we thought we knew. Now we have a chance to know it, in some very different ways. All right, let's go back to the presentation. There we are. I'll end by just talking a little bit about AI and the future of testimony. Dimensions and Testimony is not exactly an AI project because, it uses machine learning, but remember about Dimensions and Testimony, this is an example, I think, of authenticity that still is so important for our relationship. These are recorded answers by Holocaust survivors, and what's different is the way in which we access them. The questions that are asked, and again, we analyzed 40,000 questions asked by users to find out what they're interested in, and they're interested in a wide range of things. But the AI part is the connection between the question and the answer. So like determining, and that's really, I think, some interesting algorithmic, ethical and epistemological questions, right? How does the AI know which answer to play? It doesn't really know, it's trained. It's guided by human beings. And that guiding process happens through a neural network so that the inputs, which can really be anything at all. One of the questions asked very frequently is actually, do you still hate the Germans? Asked hundreds of times by the general public, by kids, by school kids. And there's different outputs, some of which are played more frequently, some of which are played less frequently. They're probably weighted slightly differently. But it's assigned a confidence score. That connection is where the AI component comes in, not in the creation of, say, a synthetic answer. ChatGPT will make synthetic answers, but again, that's a limit that I think that we have to confront. This is figuring out the best pre-recorded answer to play. In any case, no new answers are made up, and this differs dramatically from something like this. I've been, like I mentioned earlier, talking to Anne Frank. I ask questions. These are screenshots from my phone. Hello there, I'm Anne Frank. Even in the darkest times, I believe people are truly good at heart, and through my diary, I've shared my dreams of equality and peace. Let's discuss how we can find hope even when it seems lost. This kind of rhythmic happiness of sorts, things are bad, but yet they're okay, is very common actually in the ChatGPT outputs. You get this a lot. You can say, even when we had scarce food and rampant disease and relentless labor and constant fear of death, each day was a struggle to survive amidst immense suffering and loss. And just later then, she says, I held on to fleeting dreams of freedom, even in the most dehumanizing condition. We do not know how this was sourced. We can't figure it out because it's black boxed. It's not accessible. And this raises huge questions, I think, for provenance. One of the things I've tried to do in the book is I think an ethics of the algorithm has to provide as much documentation as possible. That we give you the data as much as we can. We give you you can download it, you can play with it. We talk about the decisions we made. There are choices, obviously, in any work, but the choices are occluded. And that's actually, I think, very problematic when we're talking about a historical record. So among other things, you have the potential to misinform, promote falsehoods, and this is all in that UNESCO report. So I'll end with one slide of saying how we are using AI, because I think there are some possibilities of doing some of the work we did earlier, especially around question characterization and semantic triplets, a little better, using language models to help disambiguate pronouns, understand context windows, and just an example here, we had this question of what were they like marching in? What were the German soldiers like marching in? The language model figured out from a context window that was what was being asked. And we do this thing called explainable and accountable AI, which is to ask the AI, actually, how did you come up with that decision? And then for anything changed, we look at it. That is to say, we use our human judgment, because human judgment still matters, in order to figure this out. And this is actually Billy Peer is an undergraduate, second-year student at UCLA working with me. Ulysses is a postdoc, and we have an AI and cultural heritage team where we're trying to use AI in sensible ways to do historical research more accurately and better. So that's where we currently are. And this is my last slide. Ultimately, I think what we're after is reparative work, right? That continually confronts, documents, interprets the cultural record of past injustices, using computational tools to do that, along with humanities. And if you want to read more about it, you can get 30% off. This is Princeton gave me a nice code. So those of you at home on Zoom or here, there's a code you can use to get the book, I think, for like $29. And I'm happy to answer questions, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just a reminder to people on Zoom, you can use the Q&A feature, and we'll ask your questions in the room. And are you okay? Are you okay calling on people?
Sure. Do you want to do one in person first?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Please.
I'm interested in kind of how people can teach about the Holocaust and educational systems in high schools and things like that. And so I was wondering how you think you can balance making information engaging for youth and easily digestible without reducing people to bare data and still kind of citing your sources and stuff like that.
Right. Well, I think that in some ways you almost answered part of the question in the way you phrased that, which is how. So the question that just to rephrase for those of you who are on Zoom was how to make source material like testimonies available to the youth, students, other generations, but to do so in a way that's not reductive, right? As you said, like reducing people just to data points. And I think that's probably one of the challenges of a project like Dimensions in Testimony. So part of the idea of that project is precisely to have recorded firsthand testimony. And in fact, sometimes thousands of answers. I mean, which is really extraordinary. If you think about the answers that are given, the questions that are asked, usually people are not asked 2,000 questions, but in some cases, as many as that were actually asked or close to it. And so what you have are many kind of fragments of testimony, many different answers, that then it's up really to the user to figure out either how to stitch them together or, and of course you're not going to stitch together 2,000, but maybe to think about, okay, well, how long are you going to stay engaged? What kind of questions are you going to ask? I mean, is there a kind of continuity of narrative making, which I think actually is where some of the ethical questions come in, right? When one continues to ask those questions to a survivor using this kind of multimodal platform like DIT. Another way it comes in is, I think, through the analytical work. I mean, the analytical work that we are doing has always been with digital humanities students at UCLA. And one of the things that I've always tried to emphasize and had asked the students to participate in the Bearing Witness project. I wanted them to talk to survivors and do the analytical work side by side. I thought as long as you could do that, that is, that we still had that opportunity, we should go and listen to survivors, because the survivors are not data. Right, and they're telling stories, and that embodied experience is so important. And I think that will not be the case that we continue to have that firsthand account, but we do have, I think, all these projects that are really, I think, trying to, if not replicate an embodied experience, then at least to begin to ask ourselves, like, what responsibility do we have, right, as people in the world, as people encountering these archives? What responsibility do we have to listen, and how do we do that? Right? And I think that's at the core of what these projects are about. Insofar as listening is, I think opportunities are proliferated. I think that's exactly against the idea of reducing people to bare data, or just data, just numbers. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's a brilliant research and beautifully presented. Question is about personal drive, personal motivation to research and to study. We have so many facts and data these days, and now the culture and the political realities encourage us to do fact checks and all this, we question everything. On one hand, we trust everything, and then we question everything, and we eventually forget so we are overwhelmed with facts and data, but don't know the truth, or still far from the truth. Could you please share with us and with students who are present here and who are searching for the subject or topic or subject research, in a year or two or maybe in the future, what are the questions to ask yourself in this sort of overflow of data and information, just to have that, true motivation, like almost like spiritual motivation to do something, and to be able to contextualize all this data and information, and not to betray yourself, and to be fulfilled, to be fulfilled.
Those are ultimately, those are the challenges of I think, exactly, being an
Challenge
educator.
everyone. Maybe you could just share with
I appreciate
us
that.
your driven force.
So essentially, maybe pedagogically also, what's driven me. Well, as this project got going, it did, like I said, it came in this historical moment of the recession of the survivor generation. And part of, so much of what I thought, drove me with my students was, being present and listening to stories, the ability to to touch one another, to hug one another, to eat together, right? And knowing that that was not going to be possible very soon, and it would be only through these multi-mediated ways. And so it really is this question of, I'd say, ethics and responsibility. Like, what does that mean in a digital age? And you can extend this. It doesn't have to be about Holocaust survivors. It's about really anything that then becomes mediated, and the potential, of course, as you mentioned, for disinformation or really even violence. So, what I've tried to, argue here is that there's this whole series of questions that as these experiences come to us in other modalities, like digital modalities, on Instagram or on X or whatever it is platform that we're using, we do have to ask a whole series of questions of, what is this? Where did this come from? Why is this here? Who collected it? All these questions about provenance. And I keep going back to that word, it's where I end the book, but I think digital provenance in the kind of world we're in right now of information oversaturation, of massive data that it's very hard to adjudicate. There's a responsibility, I think, of corporations to say, like, what were they training their AI on? How did, what decisions were made in the way in which these effects that are created, what does it mean that it's helpful? There's evaluative mechanisms that were used in order for language models to work the way they do. And if that's actually being then employed to do historical work, right, like with Hello History, which is based on GPT first 3.5, now 4, it's inheriting all these maybe biases or structuring decisions that were there in the language models and now to teach history. We don't know what those are. And for me, as a person that works in kind of critical algorithm studies as well as Holocaust studies, I feel like that provenance network, that ability to understand the human decision makings that give us the effects of these technologies, give us these results, we need to be able to unpack it a little bit. And so that's what I'm also trying to do with my students, is to at least start to ask these questions. Even if we can't ultimately figure out how the, whether it's a neural network or the machine learning algorithm or, the language model ultimately works, at least we start to ask these questions and also press for policy changes that these things should not be hidden from public view. These technologies are potentially public goods, but if they're in the hands of a very small corporate elite that won't tell us how they work, what they've been trained on, then we're in, I think, a very problematic place. So I think this is also part of the role and responsibility of the digital humanities at this point in time. The tools are being developed and very rapidly, and often for very different ends than the ones we're interested in, like historical ends, humanistic, humanities questions. Those are not the flavor of what OpenAI is really interested in. So in any case, I guess that's maybe a longer answer to your question.
Okay, there are 2 questions on Zoom
Okay.
that I will read.
Please.
The first one is from Alexia Rango Green, and she said, in the table of the triplets, you mentioned a distinction between active versus passive agency.
Right.
How does the project define active versus passive? Do you connect it with age?
No.
She writes, I work on children's experiences in the Holocaust, and the question of agency is a big part of your research.
That's so interesting. Yeah. Well, thank you for that question. We had only defined it grammatically using grammatical structures that Spacey had done. So looking at passive speech is really a grammatical construction. And active speech is a little problematic, again, because you have many agents who are being reported by a survivor. And again, this also requires a kind of a deep contextualization of when a particular, say, phrase or verb or expression is being used. So in our account, we don't actually, you could. We have all the metadata around, say, who the person is, what language they're speaking, how old they are, and so forth when they're talking, but we don't have that with regard to when they're talking about. So one might wonder, and actually it'd be a really interesting research question, to even study grammatical expressions in different parts of a testimony, like when they describe childhood, are they talking about different ways than, say, when they are talking about, say, a future message, right? Those would be, I think, some really interesting examples. This is, in many ways, like I said, it's a prototype of an approach to beginning to parse, the grammatical specificity of testimonies beyond indexing terms. And I think, again, indexing terms are great guides. I think they're absolutely critical. I see my colleagues, a couple from the Shoah Foundation, I don't want to say that I'm unappreciative of that because I use them all the time. And I use them all the time in order to kind of go back to the words of the survivor. And the words of the survivor often, speak to those categories and so much more. And so it's like, projects like this that I think like Alexis and others that will help us kind of like go those next steps. So I'm very appreciative of that. And yeah, I would just say the short answer is grammatical specificity, but yeah, I'd be eager to learn more about your research too.
All right, the second question is from Lauren Steyer. Sorry. Remarkable work and presentation. Thanks so much. About dimensions and testimony, have you looked at the percentage of possible answers that do not or rarely come up, or the failed questions that do not yield any answers?
Yep,
So
we
what
sure
are
have.
those percentages like?
Yeah, in fact, that was something we studied. It's in the book, and I can't remember all the answers to this, but we looked at all the questions that, one, gave rise to answers in the first place, and second, all the answers that have never been heard. And that's actually really interesting. And so it's over a period of around 2.5 years that we have data. So the USC Shoah Foundation was very generous to share a lot of this data with us. And again, I want to underscore that appreciation. We haven't been studying the project over all time. So remember, it's about 2.5 years. But in that 2.5 years, for the ones we have, it actually really is quite interesting about what people are prone to ask about and what is either never asked about or what answers never get played. And in the book, I talk about Anita Lasker-Wallfish, who is one of the ones that we have all of her questions that were asked in the original recording. We have all of her answers. Then we have all the questions the public has asked over 2.5 years, which is tens of thousands of questions, and then all the answers played. And I compared them to see actually what answers have never been heard. And there's so much more there, so much interesting stuff. I'm not going to bore you about all the examples, but it is actually something that I appreciate. It was Bob asked? Oren asked, but that's exactly in the last chapter of the book is actually about that, and also propose some ways, for as DIT continues to develop, there might be something, similar to like what you have with a ChatGPT, where you do have maybe like a memory of like what questions have already been asked that could influence, potentially. I could imagine DIT suggesting like, well, if you are interested in this question, you might want to follow up on this and this and this. Maybe to guide the readers in certain ways, maybe to even say how much of a testimony has been heard, or, in fact, you asked a lot about schooling, but you didn't ask about, bullying, for example. And maybe there's other answers that are there that would come up, and AI could, I think, help again to provide maybe guidance for users to delve more deeply into these examples of maybe answers that hadn't been heard. But yeah, that is something that we actually write about in the book, so thank you. Yeah, sorry, Sarah, right?
Yeah, thank you for this talk. I had a question about how you tackle language and the diversity of language, both in the different, like even if we're just taking the Shoah Foundation's testimonies of Jewish survivors, the range of different languages and how you're processing them, and then also thinking about the times in which testimonies being given, for example, like if there's something in German that is not translatable into English, how do you engage with that when you're doing these metadata processes?
Yeah. So the one thing, and this is especially the case like with voters' testimonies, they were recorded in 9 different languages, and of course the Shoah Foundation records in dozens of languages. We were working with a relatively small body of testimonies, primarily English, German, Yiddish, some French testimonies, but there are a whole bunch of languages and a whole bunch of testimonies that I have not worked with. And my hope is that, I can't by any means complete all the work. I know we have colleagues, all over the world, whether it's at the Hebrew University, there's a wonderful team of researchers there working with Hebrew language testimonies and Yiddish language testimonies. And so one of the things that we have been very interested in is code switching, though. So like when someone switches from one language to another language, especially in voters' testimonies, where this is very common. Sometimes and my colleague Anna Bonazi, who's one of the co-authors, is someone that really worked on this, creating not only some visualizations about like how much of a testimony is in Yiddish, then it's in German, then it's in French or whatever, or when certain languages come up, and speculating reasons as to why. Sometimes it's just a need to be understood or not being able to communicate something. Other times it's actually, I think, really quite interesting that a word, maybe is a kind of a response to a particular, trauma or context in which something is being told. There's all kinds of reasons. I have to say that we try not to come up with, like, I would say, declarative reasons as to why. It's more like to track the fact that it is multilingual. And then, to leave it up to us to like, okay, now we have to do the close reading. Now we have to do like the humanities work, right? So I think that often, again, the tools help guide us and attune us to certain things, but they can't tell us what it means. Like I can't ask, like, great, we now know it's a different language, but I have to go and now listen, right? And so I can find exactly where that is, and then I can come up with reasons. And I will say that this work, I really think the digital humanities is so critical here. It's the digital helps us to understand and attune things, to be attuned to things, to see patterns, frequencies, statistics, things that are quantifiable. But the humanities help interpret and understand value. And so that's why they can answer those questions of why. I will say I didn't have a chance to show the Mala Zimmetbaum project, this testimonial ensemble, but that comes from Yiddish, German, Hebrew, French, Ladino, maybe, and English. And we translated actually all the parts where survivors were talking about a woman named Mala Zimmetbaum, who, for me, I hadn't really appreciated or understood much about her story until I heard it in two David Boder testimonies, two women who were talking about this woman who escaped from Auschwitz by getting a prisoner uniform, and then it was found and very spectacularly hung and murdered in Auschwitz in 1944. And it comes up in two Boder testimonies. And they don't have the name quite right. It's Boder translated as Molly Zimmetbaum, and someone else as Mala Zimmet. And I was like, who is this person? And I started doing a little bit more and finding examples of her being mentioned in many testimonies. In the Shoah Foundation, the Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Fortunoff Archive, many in Yiddish and Hebrew, and again, I mentioned Ladino and German. And the idea was, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to bring together all these different perspectives on how these women remember Mala Zimmetbaum? And the fact is, they don't all align. They have different memories. They generally align, and so that we call it a testimonial ensemble. And I had translated with a number of other students from all those languages into English. Then we did the semantic triplets and created this sort of interactive way in which you can search on what do they say the perpetrators did, what do they say she did, what did they say her boyfriend Edith had done, and you kind of get this sense of like this massively like polyvocal testimony. It's a kind of memorial in a way to her because Mala Zimmetbaum didn't give any testimonies. I mean, she was killed, and yet she persists in the stories of all these other women and a few men who knew something about her. So that's one way that we also dealt with multilingualism, but there it was, our acts of translation. Yeah, Wolf?
Yeah, thank you so much. This was fascinating, and so many questions were put asked. Just the last one brought me to a question. When one in the earlier slides, you had this kind of metadata leads to new narrative and new interpretations. So I wanted to kind of push you a little bit more to elaborate on what means actually new narrative here. Is this the changing the narrative of the testimony or our narrative? Can you elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. No, it was just to say that this process is recursive. As I say, I don't think that we have narratives, which are like testimonial narratives. They're obviously spoken, performed. There's, of course, video. There's already a process by which the narratives are turned into transcripts. The transcripts are turned into metadata with tags. They're segmented, in the case of the Shoah Foundation, into 1-minute segments. In the case of Boder, he segmented by page, by typewritten page, which is actually interesting too, because how his indexing was, what's on my typewritten page. And so the medium there is a way of guiding future interpreters. Well, my point about that is that there's a whole series of decisions that are made in order to make something that is spoken and performed computationally, I'd say, tractable, as a computer can do things, find things. It's used for search, it's used for, obviously indexing. It's not ever complete. I guess that's my point. And so why new narratives? Not like that the testimonies generate new narratives, but when we are able to go to those narratives in perhaps new ways, maybe create more data, maybe more ways of contextualizing them, of comparing them, of bringing them together, they could inform, I'd say, new approaches, to, say, the historical record. I think in some ways it's similar. Maybe, I mean, your work that you've done, like micro-histories of resistance, I think is an example where the historian goes to the archive and is attuned to certain things, finds things, brings those out, and they change the way we think about what resistance was. Right? When I was doing some of this work in the Shoah Foundation, I was interested in similar things. I was like, sometimes these examples of micro acts of resistance are just said in passing. I threw chestnuts back at this kid. I was like, that's so strange. It's never going to be marked up in an index of like active resistance because it's just throwing chestnuts. And yet that's a remarkable act of just very small kind of resistance. And so the approach that I had here is like that just helps us to have a greater appreciation of the complexity. And so by new narratives, I really mean just to appreciate their complexity in other ways. Yeah, Crispin.
Thank you again for a really super illuminating talk. I want to ask, just going from sort of the archival sort of perspective and side of things, given the sort of proliferation or massive potential of the tools that you're talking about, what do you see as the responsibility for archives to kind of make use of these tools and build them into the kind of, in thinking of archives as arbiters of memory in a way. The indexing does what it does, but as you point out, also doesn't do a lot of things. And then sort of as a possible add-on to that, is there a risk of getting into what Jason Lustig refers to in his Time to Gather book about Jewish 20th century archives as the kind of the fantasy of the total archive? So there's these potential earlier question of oversaturation.
Right.
So,
I think that's great. I appreciate that. With regard to the first question, which is just about whether the archivists, should, maybe engage with these tools or use them, I don't think the answer is very simple, yes or no. I think it's actually about the willingness of the archives to collaborate, hopefully with scholars and others who want to explore ways to use these archives and maybe develop tools that would become interoperable, shareable. I mentioned, for example, like the Geography of the Holocaust Project, which is partnering with a number of institutions, I think the Shoah Foundation, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. I don't think it's incumbent on the archive necessarily to develop all these, GIS historical gazetteers, but to make the data available for archivists and in formats that could be usable, shareable, and again, where we can trace back, who did what, right? The size of the material, is overwhelming. And I think there are some new consortial approaches as well. I think of the European Holocaust Research Group, which is an example as well of consortial approaches to looking at archives, working with developing, whether it's standards and practices, and then sharing those out internationally. Those would be the kind of the approach I would say would make the most sense. Consortial, interoperable, and the ability for scholars to, participate in, but I don't think the archive should be saddled with the burden of doing it all themselves. And so, I've always appreciated the willingness of the foundation to share so much material with me, versions of the database, the thesaurus, the transcripts, the videos, all of which allowed us to do the kind of explorations that we did. And I think also to build out, some possibilities for both methods and new interpretations. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah, the question here?
All right, we have to wrap it up now.
Oh, okay. Do we do? Okay, well, we can talk afterwards.
Yeah, Todd could stick around afterwards.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you so much,
Okay.
Todd.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
I want to thank our co-sponsor, the U.S. Humanities in a Digital World program, for promoting the lecture and supporting it. And we'll see you at our next lecture in just over 2 weeks, another Digital Humanities lecture about landscapes of Holocaust rescue in France as analyzed through computational methods.
Oh, wow.
So please join us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.